the only thing I saw was a long documentary by Lucy Worsley on the suffragettes.
Oh,
So I don't know if that's the only thing I had seen on at home, and that was on a catch-up service. I saw that on the BBC iPlayer.
Oh no, I think that counts.
yeah, that works. Yeah,
Yeah,
that works.
Okay.
Yeah.
yeah, you've seen the whole thing then.
Yes.
All right, cool. Talk to us about Lucy Worsley.
Lucy Worsley is a historian, and she does British historian. She does a lot on the royals. She does a lot on sort of women in through history. She has women's place in sort of history at the time. So she is sort of like an expert, and she's a scholar and a writer, and she's humorous as well. So she did this. It's an hour and a half long documentary about the suffragettes.
And she
And
she does love dressing up, doesn't she?
she
Is
does
that
dressing up. And so
is that
throughout
the
this, she
blonde?
did dress up.
Is that the blonde lady with the she's
She
got like a bit of
she has a bit of a lisp.
little tiny bit of a lisp because she's
Yes,
brilliant.
that's the
I love
one.
her stuff. I love her stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this was, I hadn't seen it before. It's a couple of years old now. I think it was originally made to tie in with the anniversary of the women's suffrage movement, when women actually, the anniversary of when women did get the vote. But it's for all that, it was, it's a fact gripping story. Basically, it starts off how the fight for women's voting. It started off with the suffragist movement, which started in the sort of Victoria's day in like the 1850s, and the first sort of 50 years of their existence, they basically asked politely, saying, women should have the vote, because there was a fight going on about. It started off about addressing women's lack of rights, in that they had no right over their property. They had no right, once they were married, their husband basically owned their property, and owned their children, and they had
Mm.
no basic rights of their own. And it started off joined hand in hand with like the temperance movement, where people campaigned for people to sort of abstain from alcohol, because basically what was happening, men would be leaving the factories, and then on the way home they'd be passing half a dozen pubs, and so potentially by the time they got home, they'd have like pence left, and they would hand over to their wives, because their wives had no money, means of it earning an income, had no money of their own, would be
Yeah.
given like 3 pence to feed them and like 10 children. And women were absolutely in desperate situations. They had no recourse in law. They had no one who would support them. So the women's suffrage movement started really early on in like the 1850s, 1860s. So by the time it got to sort of 1905, women were basically fed up of asking politely for 40 years to be completely ignored. So the radical sort of women's suffragette movement started with people like Emmeline Pankhurst, who decided that if polite means are not working, we are going to take more direct means. And this documentary charts basically the escalation from starting off basically writing petitions, rallies, and speeches, to actually turning radical. And one of the first acts of what they were doing was deliberately getting themselves arrested and deliberately getting themselves sent to prison. And a guaranteed way of getting sent to prison in sort of 1905, 1908 was actually assaulting a police officer. So whenever they were challenged at rallies, they would like spit at police officers, and this would basically get them arrested. And so the sight of respectable middle class women being hauled in front of the courts and generated a lot of publicity.
Yep.
And so
So
then there was this campaign basically to get arrested and get sent to jail, even though
so
the
so
treatment in.
so it's weird that I'm thinking this, but I'm kind of like, even though it's a documentary, I'm like, and it's history. I'm like, Sharon, no spoilers.
Mm.
But obviously with Lucy Worsley's particular time, I'm guessing that with this you would have seen a lot of her dressing up. There would have been a lot of her
Yeah,
dressing
it's
up.
dramatized.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there'll be a lot of dress and all that. How is her telling of this story? Because I know that there's been a lot of different ways. There was even the film Suffragettes, where they had,
Yes.
what was it, Carrie Mulligan in it?
Very
And I know it had,
Mulligan in it. Yes.
yeah, and
And
it had Meryl Streep in a small role, but
yeah,
it's
she plays Emmeline Pankhurst in the
Pankhurst, yeah,
film.
so
And Helena
and
Bonham Carter.
yeah, so but with that, how was Lucy Worsley's telling of this whole thing?
Yeah, so they get basically actresses to take a part of a well-known suffragette, and then they dramatize it. So they read their own letters, their diaries, and their accounts. So the story is told by Lucy Worsley talking direct to camera, but also these actresses saying, "This was my experience of being force fed in jail, because they then escalated from being arrested, they went on hunger strike, and then as soon as they got too weak, the government didn't want people to die in jail, these women to die, so they were released. But then when that didn't really stop the suffragettes they didn't shut them up, basically.
Yeah.
They were still being arrested and still going on hunger strike. They started force feeding these women by forcing a rubber tube up their nose and then down into their gullet, and then pouring liquid egg and milk down into their throats. And one of these women was sort of dramatically saying, this was my experience of how I was force fed while I was in prison. And then it escalated to women chaining themselves to rails. On one day, they had a mass campaign where they were going to smash as many windows as possible in London, and something like 287 properties were damaged in one afternoon, where they synchronized themselves, they concealed themselves all around London, and as soon as the Big Ben struck, they all started smashing windows. Ooh. And they caused the equivalent of something like £250,000 worth of damage in one afternoon. So this was a serious campaign, but they still were completely ignored. And it was only basically at the start of the First World War when they called a truce, saying that we will no longer participate in our direct action, we will support the war effort, that they were actually start to be taken seriously. So it was a long campaign, and women were actually given the vote. Some women over age 35 who owned property were given the vote in 1918, and then all women over 21 were eventually given the vote in 1928. So it's basically that long struggle to say why women got to they're so desperate to have a say and to have a vote. And we see today the situation where we've had women prime ministers, and sometimes that works out okay, and sometimes that could be more of a challenge. But it is timely. I thought this is quite timely actually, that it's taken from the first prime minister, obviously Margaret Thatcher, was something like 50 years, was it, from when women got the vote to when we had the first MP within a couple of years, Nancy Astor. But the first prime minister was obviously the 1970s with Margaret Thatcher. We've had two other women prime ministers since then. So yeah, that struggle, so that we, even though we look at politics and we go, for women, and for me, I always think women fought long and hard. This wasn't just like a couple of women throwing stones to when they got the vote. This was like 60 years women were fighting and petitioning and lobbying Parliament to have the right to say, I own property, I have a right to my children, I have a right to my own body, and I have a right to have an interest in the political life of my country.
Yeah.
So vote, women.
We're gonna file that one under People Suck. So how many stars would you give it? I can tell you were quite taken with this. How many stars would you give?
I thought it was fascinating. Yeah, I certainly give it 4 stars, easily.
4 stars. Do you know what it was actually called? I've just written on Lucy Worsley Suffragette.
Yes, that's it.
Is that what it's called? Lucy Worsley Suffragette?
I think it's Suffragettes by Lucy Worsley.
All right. Okay. Gotcha. All right. So, and I could have done this differently, but anyway, it's back to you again. I could almost give it a 5-star, because I thought it was almost flawless in its execution. Mm-hmm. Actually, I'm going to up it. I'm going to give it a 5-star. For a documentary, I thought it was flawless. There's nothing about it that I would like to say, can you tell me more about that? It touched on everything you needed to know. So I'll give it a 5-star.
That's high praise indeed, isn't it? Sharon very rarely gives a 5-star. Good for you, mate. Good for you.
Yeah. Okay. All right, cool.